American participants, say good evening to our European participants. And if you are on a third continent, please feel welcome to this new event in the Hertie School Democracy Promotion After Afghanistan series. After quite a long break during this window, we now resume in a moment which may not look the most cheerful moment for democracy or for Europe, and in particularly for Ukraine. We have dedicated the today's session to discuss the trade-offs for the European democracy promotion and the quite significant challenges that we seem to be encountering in the European neighborhood. We were preparing this even before the latest events, and now it just seems that the challenges have got ever higher. We have two absolutely great guests and two persons who I absolutely admire because they are in the same time scholars and activists of the kind that we really like to show you here in this series of talk. So on one hand, we have Dr. Radwan Masmoudi, who is an engineer, has all his degrees from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, including his PhD, but he is Tunisian, and he is head of a think tank based in DC and in the same time in Tunisia, which works on Islam and democracy. So welcome, Radwan. Thank you very much for joining us. On the other hand, we have Dr. Gerald. We have Dr. Gerald Knaus, an old friend, fairly known to Berliners because he's frequently in the media. And in European, I think his origins are lost in the complexity of his moving around countries so that intelligence services completely lose his track. But I know from a confidential source that he is and has always been born an Austrian who studied in Oxford, in Bologna, spent a few years at Harvard associated with the Carr Human Rights Center, and is a great friend of the Hertie School, where he is regularly invited. Gerald heads a fairly non-conformist but very famous small think tank called European Stability Initiative, which has started to work on the Balkans, but had meanwhile started to work on a variety of topics, the latest of which, of course, for which he is the most known, is asylum policy, on which to which his last book is dedicated. And I will start with Gerald as an European and closer with the rest of us to the Eastern Boredom presently. Gerald has really worked a lot, and he's been instrumental in coming up with a solution at the last refugee crisis, since he was actually an expert on Turkey, working on Turkey's accession into the European Union. He was well placed to think in both terms, in instrumental terms on how to solve it, and also in human rights terms, because he is and has always been a sort of human rights activist. So Gerald, let me start with you and ask about what we really see unfolding in the news today. Already in the Belarus crisis of the last elections, we have seen that refugees can become a weapon in the hands of very bad regimes. And here we're looking at something of far greater proportion, this Ukrainian crisis. Maybe should we really be concerned that Putin might use people there as a weapon, might send new waves of refugees for Europe, might use refugees in any other way? Are we better prepared in any way compared to the last crisis to counteract that? And can we actually think preventively? And what should we do in the case that he will also use these unscrupulous actions as he had done so many other things in the past weeks? Gerald?
Yes, thank you, Alina. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm glad to be here. And I hope the connection will hold up. If it doesn't, give me a signal, and then I need to move something. Well, let me first stress one very, very important point. My great discomfort with this now very popular theory that migrants or refugees are used as weapons. Because when we look at the crisis in Ukraine, the real similarity should be to the Syrian crisis. And the real question is, will the European Union react to Ukraine in the way Turkey has reacted to the Syrians? Which means for 4 years, Turkey had open borders. Syrians could enter Turkey without a visa. And although initially it was a few 100,000 and then it ended up being millions, and today it's 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, Turkey for 4 years left its borders open. This has changed. Turkey's borders are now closed, as are those of Lebanon or Israel and the neighbors of Syria. But the important thing is that for 4 years, by having open borders, Turkey became the country in the world with most refugees. 1/3 of the additional refugees in the world in the last decade were taken in by one country, Turkey. Now, why is this similar to Ukraine? Because we are not actually talking here about, as in the case of Belarus, people who are lured into Belarus with false promises, Iraqis who buy tickets in travel agencies controlled by the regime, to then be pushed from Belarus into the European Union. Now, that is instrumentalizing and abusing the desire to migrate. In the case of Ukraine, we are talking about Ukrainians who might have to flee because of a war. And at this moment, no Ukrainian has to go to the European Union across a secret border with smugglers because they have visa-free travel. Every Ukrainian can, with his passport or her passport, just travel into the European Union and legally stay there for 3 months. So the big question, I think that's the central moral question for Europe, is simply, are Europeans ready not to view Ukrainians as tools or weapons, this horrible jargon that we've adopted, but as victims who we owe something to, because, well, we can't defend them at this moment. Certainly if there's a big war, Europeans bear some responsibility, but at the very least, we should let them in. And here, I think Turkey offers, for certainly the first 4 years, an example that Europeans would do well to emulate. The big moral question is, will anyone in the European Union come up with what I think is the immoral idea at some stage of introducing a visa requirement for Ukrainians? I very much hope not. And if not, then this would be a very, very different crisis from what we see at other borders, where Europeans are using violence and force to push people back. Ukrainians, at this moment, if they get to the European border, they show their passport, they get in.
Well, I think some preparations are made already in Poland and Romania. And I think that these countries are aware and are preparing for refugees from Ukraine in the first stage. But then again, it's going to be at the individual decisions of countries, right? Because Europe has not very, very well solved collectively the problem of asylum.
Well, the important thing is when people can travel visa-free, the system that Europeans have created, which never really worked, the so-called Dublin system, where people have to apply for asylum in the first country that they reach, doesn't work, because Ukrainians can enter the European Union, can travel anywhere in the European Union, and can then apply for asylum anywhere legally. So they could all go to Germany or Sweden legally, because they don't enter irregularly. They don't enter as asylum seekers. They enter as tourists. And then they have the right to apply. So the idea that somehow they will all be stuck in the first countries they enter is based on a complete misunderstanding, both of the law in Europe and of the reality of visa-free travel. So Ukrainians, I assume, and of course, it's impossible to predict numbers because we do not know how the war will go. And in the last 8 years, the ongoing war in eastern Ukraine, which produced more than 1 million internally displaced already did not lead to an increase of Ukrainian asylum seekers in the European Union. On the contrary, the number halved. So in 2015, you had 20,000 asylum applications by Ukrainians, and in 2019, you had 10,000. So it's very hard to predict. But let's assume the worst, that there will be millions of people fleeing. Well, my prediction will be they will go to where there are already Ukrainians and where they expect there to be an infrastructure to look after them. And the usual countries, Germany, the Nordic countries, Poland, where there are already many Ukrainians, and that's where we'll go. The idea that you can distribute them in Europe, well, that's a very nice idea, but we never managed to get people to stay in any one country if they didn't want to. And with open borders inside Europe, this cannot be enforced.
Well, thank you very much, Gerald. This is very clear. So yes, definitely the only thing that we should rejoice about is the fact that we promoted visa-free status for Ukrainians over 10 years ago, because we've been both part of that. Of course, we had no idea that this is what it would come for, but that is, in fact, good news in many ways. Well, let's hope that's not needed, because one problem with helping asylum seekers is that we are diminishing the number, the critical mass in the countries which need to stay there and fight, against the bad regimes. But on the other hand, when it's a war at hand and not just the normal, ordinary day fight for democracy, of course, we really have to open up. And these are very good points. Let me move to Radwan now. And I really suggest if you can do something to improve your connection, Gerald, please do, because your sound is breaking now and then. So it would be great. So East looks fairly bad, right? But the Mediterranean doesn't look very well either, right? And Tunisia in particular was the poster child of the Arab Spring, was the only country which was considered a success, or at least had a reasonable hope of success. So what happened there? What happened there, and are we as Europeans doing the right thing to help at least Tunisia return on track?
Well, thank you, Alina. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Look, democracy is in trouble everywhere, I think, in the world, and is in retreat for the past 10 years, especially in the MENA region, in the Middle East and North Africa, the southern borders of Europe. Democracy is not doing too well. I think it's for a very simple reason, is that there is an axis of autocracy in the Arab world, led by Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have invested literally billions of dollars to destabilize these nascent democracies. Any attempt to build a democracy in the Arab world is seen by these countries as a threat to them and to their stability and to their regimes. And so they have invested really not millions, but billions of dollars for the last 10 years. First in Egypt, supporting the coup against Morsi, the military coup in 2013. Then they moved on to Libya, they moved on to Yemen, they moved on to Syria, and also to Tunisia. Even in 2013, there was an attempt, since 2012 and 2013, to foment a coup in Tunisia and to destabilize Tunisia. They see democracy as a threat to them and to their stability, and therefore they are doing everything they can to destabilize, to not allow democracy to succeed in Tunisia or anywhere in the Arab world. So in the case of the European Union, I think the EU helped Tunisia in the last 10 years, but not enough. I think they saw the opportunity of Tunisia, because Tunisia was the only successful democracy for the last 10 years in the Arab world, but successful only politically. I mean, only in the political sense, the political system, the political institutions, the constitution, the elections, the parliament, and so on. But economically, it was not successful. And socially also, in terms of social justice, in terms of distribution of wealth among the regions or among the classes of the population, also it was not successful. So the EU helped Tunisia, but not enough. It could have done a lot more to help Tunisia to succeed, and it didn't. It could have helped economically. As you know, not only after a revolution or during a transition, it is hard to focus on the political system and also on the economy at the same time. You know, so all of the political class in Tunisia, civil society included, were focusing on the political reforms, on building democracy. And we really didn't have time. We really did not have a chance to focus on the economy. You know, we were worried about democracy. We said, let's first establish a real democracy. Let's make sure that democracy is consolidated, is stable, is strong, and then we will turn an eye to the economy. Well, we didn't have enough time, because then we had, of course, the pandemic in the last 2 years, which made the economy a lot worse. Tunisia's economy, gross domestic product, fell by 20% in the last 2 years. 1/5 of the economy was wiped out in the last 2 years. And of course, this was felt mostly by the poor people, the underclass, you know, the less privileged people, who all of a sudden became really in a very difficult situation. So the Tunisian transition needed more economic assistance, needed more economic help to stabilize the economy, especially in the last 2 years, but it did not get it. And in fact, this reminds me a little bit, Alina, of the following of the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, all of a sudden, the European Union had almost 15 new countries who wanted to join the European Union. The European Union not only welcomed them as members of the EU, but invested hundreds of billions of dollars in those countries, not only to stabilize their economies, but also to help them build their new democratic institutions. To me, this was the best investment that the EU has ever made, you know, because now it is enjoying the fruits of that stability in the entire European Union. Imagine if the European Union did not invest that money into the Eastern European countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. You would have had a total mess, you know, in those 15 countries, a total collapse, perhaps, of order in the states in those countries, and the European Union would have had a much worse situation than it is now. So I think that the European Union definitely could have and should have helped Tunisia. And until today, when we had a coup on July 25 against the constitution, against the parliament, the elected parliament was closed, the government was closed. Now even the judicial system is being closed and controlled by the president. The president wants to basically abolish the constitution, write a new constitution where the president controls everything. I mean, it is a total autocratic regime. But where is the European Union? We don't really hear strong enough condemnation from the European Union or the European countries, and demands that Tunisia reopens the parliament. At a minimum, you cannot have a democracy without a parliament. At a minimum, you must reopen the parliament, and then you must respect the rule of law, you must respect the constitution. I mean, there are many other things, but at a minimum, you have to reopen the parliament. So I think the EU needs to speak up more forcefully about Tunisia. I think Tunisia is still winnable. I am very optimistic that Tunisia will go back to democracy, will restore its democracy, because the Tunisians have tasted freedom in the last 10 years. And I don't think they are willing to give it up. I think they will fight for their freedoms and they will reestablish democracy. But we definitely need help, more help and more assistance from the EU and from our democratic friends across the world.
It is not actually a bit of contradiction here, because the argument that I heard in Europe is that we do not want to cut the money to Tunisia. You just said that this economic aid is very important. And I'm going to tell you the truth. In the first 10 years of the East European transformation, there has not been so much EU money. You know, that started a little bit later. Countries struggled a lot. There were terrible figures of unemployment. You know, in Poland, in my country, there was terrible inflation. So people have been through a lot of misery. And don't forget, we had former Yugoslavia. So it's not like we, you know, things didn't end up badly. In fact, it was probably former Yugoslavia and the disaster there, which was like the decisive step convincing Europe it has to enlarge to the East, because there's no other way to stabilize the region. Okay. So, you know, unfortunately, bad things have to happen for people to learn. But coming to your economic argument, you know, I mean, clearly now, what should we do? Should we cut the money to Tunisia until parliament is restored or not? That is, you know, the question.
I think the answer is very simple. I think we need to increase assistance to Tunisia to help Tunisia succeed in its democratic transition. But this increase and any economic assistance or any military assistance or cooperation must be conditional. We cannot, and you must not, support a dictator in Tunisia or anywhere else. So Qais Said right now wants to become a dictator. And if you give him money unconditionally, you are by definition supporting dictatorship. You are supporting him to become a dictator. So the money should be there, but it should be conditional. We support a democratic Tunisia. If you go back to democracy, if you go back to open the parliament, which was elected by the people, to respecting the rule of law and rule of constitution, you know, respecting the constitution, respecting the independence of the judiciary, there must be conditions attached. You cannot just give money to a dictator who wants to destroy democracy. I think that will be a terrible mistake.
Yes, we understand that, but you know, we have a very vast academic literature on conditionality, empirical literature of people who examine that, and conditionality never works. It never works, not only because, you know, the countries that we try to condition, their rulers do whatever it's in their interest, but because the donors don't really enforce conditionality, almost never. And of course, the reason why this happens is that democracy promotion is not our sole goal. We have also other interests. There are also other competing elements on the policy agenda. And in relation to the Mediterranean, of course, we return to the original question, and we invite also Gerald to tell us his point of view. We are, of course, very concerned not to have, you know, refugees coming from, and to stop the normal migrant flux which comes to MENA countries and then to Europe on. And therefore, it's quite difficult for us to cut the money to these regimes, even if some of them are autocratic, others are very corrupt regimes. So what is the intermediate solution to this? Because otherwise, I take very clear your point and, you know, cut the aid now and restore the aid in the moment when Parliament and the Judicial Council are restored. It seems to make a lot of sense to me, except that we do not know how much time that would take. And there is, of course, a risk in Brussels that we will, you know, only have then non-cooperative regimes in this migration question, which is so important for Europe.
It's a very good, valid question. I think the problem is that people in the EU, but also in the US, the policymakers, tend to be very short-term oriented. You know, they want to solve all these problems of migration or security or stability very short, you know, very immediate. They want to see immediate results. But these are problems that have long-term causes and long-term problems that require long-term thinking, long-term approaches and solutions. And sometimes, you know, democracy promotion is, of course, a long-term project. You know, you cannot build democracy in 1 month or 2 months or 6 months. It takes years, sometimes longer, sometimes maybe decades to build a successful democracy. So the politicians in Brussels or even in the EU, sometimes they don't have that patience. And they think that supporting autocratic regimes, it gives them the impression of a short-term solution. To me, it's really like marijuana. It's like illicit drugs. You know, it's a shot in the arm. It makes you feel better. Somehow you think that you solved the problem. In reality, it makes all these problems worse. What is causing the Arab world, the mess in the entire Arab world, is the dictatorship of these regimes, is the fact that we have regimes that are not accountable to their people, that are not helping their people or developing good economies or fighting corruption or building just system and equal justice and freedom and opportunities, especially for young people. This is the main cause for lack of stability, lack of security, or for the problem of migration. So you don't solve it by supporting oppressive regimes, thinking that, hey, they will provide stability. They have not provided stability in the last 50 years or 60 years. What makes you think they're going to provide stability in the next 5 years? In the case of Tunisia, specifically in the case of Tunisia, I think Tunisia has already achieved a lot in the last 10 years. I think it's very close to becoming a successful, stable democracy. And therefore, if the EU and the US right now withhold their assistance, I think the coup will end in 1 or 2 months, because the regime is really out of money, out of cash. As you probably, if you've been following the news, they have been unable to pay the salaries last month, except 10 days late and 2 weeks late. And even this month, they are again unable to pay the salaries. Food is very scarce. The bread and butter, you know, the basic necessities are very scarce in Tunisia. I think the government is going bankrupt and desperately needs US assistance, EU assistance, IMF loan to survive just for the next 2 or 3 or 4 months. So if we say, no, we will not give you this money, there is money for Tunisia, but we will not give it to you until you reopen the parliament. I promise you, I bet you that the parliament will be reopened immediately in 1 month. If the parliament is opened immediately in 1 month or even in 1 week, it doesn't solve the entire problem, but it puts Tunisia back on the path of democracy, because Qais Said will no longer be able to rule by decree, where he can make up laws in his head and sign them at night, and then in the morning he can sign a piece of paper and it becomes a law. By making these decrees, he's destroying all the institutions of democracy. If we allow him for another 3 months or 6 months to rule Tunisia by decree, we will have lost everything. It will not be able to replace. He also wants to change the constitution. So I think Tunisia is actually not that difficult. I mean, I see in other countries, in Libya, in Egypt, or even Algeria, Sudan, it's more complicated. It's more difficult. It will take longer time. In Tunisia, it's actually, we were very close to democracy. We were very close to building a real...
Forgive me for challenging this, but you know, I see a good question on the chat. And by the way, I want to encourage all our guests to write questions in the chat. I'm going to follow this, and so is Chris Abels, our moderator, who helps me from backstage. The question really is, but your feeling that Tunisia was really getting there, was this shared by a majority of Tunisians? Because after all, we have seen that there were quite a significant number of riots across the country, of people who were upset with what democracy delivered and discontent. As an expert of corruption who only looks at that now and then, I also had the impression that cutting rents, okay, not just adopting 5 years anti-corruption plans from OECD, but really going for cutting privileges and rents by Democrats, did not go far enough, you know, to give the population the impression that there is some drive towards equality. So in other words, actually, how much support is for the president presently? Because he was voted and he has supporters. It's the same story as within European Union, you know, with Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban would fall tomorrow if there would not be a significant number of Hungarians who vote for him and who endorse his regime. Okay, so what do we do about that? I mean, let's say we cut the aid, but are there sufficient numbers there on the side of democracy and who are not disappointed with democracy?
Yes, I think the majority of Tunisians want democracy to succeed, as I said, because they tasted democracy. They were not happy or satisfied with what democracy delivered in terms of economic prosperity or economic growth or employment or even fighting corruption. They were not satisfied. The majority of Tunisians were happy with democracy, the freedoms that they enjoyed, politically, the political system in general, they were happy with it, but they were unhappy and very disappointed and angry with lack of economic opportunities. That is a fact. So, but look, you have demonstrations in the US, in Europe, in France. You have the Gilets jaunes and Gilets rouges and Gilets orange, people demonstrating in the streets for years, you know, against the political system, against corruption, unhappy with the results of democracy. In the US, where I am now, you know, 40% of the people still vote for Trump and still like Trump and still believe that the last election were rigged. I mean, it's hard to believe, but they think that the last election in the US were rigged. So there is a number of people who are not happy. They are not satisfied. I don't think they are a majority. Now, on July 25, yes, the coup had a little bit, a lot of support from the Tunisian population for two reasons. A, because they were unhappy with the economic situation. The economic situation was a total mess. Even the political situation was a crisis. There was a political crisis, social crisis, and all that. But also because Kais Said promised initially that he will respect the constitution. He said, I'm going to fix the problem, I'm going to fix the system, but within the constitution. If you remember his speeches early on in July and August and even early September. It was not until end of September, beginning of October, when he started saying, no, I'm going to rule by decree, I'm not going to respect the constitution anymore. I am the state, I am the constitution, I can rule by decree. And that his popularity has been really falling since then tremendously, from like 80% to now around 20 or 30% popularity. It might be even less because of the current economic. Even in terms of economy, what has he done in terms of economy? In 7 months of total power, he can do whatever he wants. He can rule by decree and do anything he wants with the stroke of a pen. What has he done in 7 months? The situation is a lot worse economically today than it was on July 25. People are really hurting and suffering, and I think they are turning against Kais Said because he has not delivered anything, and because he turned against the constitution on which he swore to allegiance and he swore to respect the constitution. Yes, there are problems even in our political system. There are reforms that are needed, and definitely in our economic system, there are a lot of reforms that are needed, but they have to be done according to the law, by respecting the law, by respecting the constitution, not by building another autocratic state and one man can decide for the whole country like we had under Ben Ali before or under Gaddafi in next door Libya. I don't think the Tunisian people will accept that.
Gerald, so what do we do to avoid a trade-off between our democracy promotion goals and more realistic goals, like it happened with Turkey that you know so well? Because the years when, in fact, Turkey was so helpful in Syria coincided quite unhappily with the years when, in fact, the autocracy in Turkey became worse and worse. What can Europe actually do to navigate in this very new, complicated context?
Well, let me make a very concrete proposal that at the moment my colleagues and myself are trying to advocate for here in Berlin, and try to show that perhaps there isn't this devilish trade-off between having control, for example, at Europe's borders and supporting autocrats. I mean, what would happen? And I would be very interested what Radwan thinks. What would happen if the European Union would now put on the table an offer to Tunisia very similar to the offer that Alina, myself, we all pushed for so many years, for Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, and for the Western Balkans. And we ran a whole campaign for 15 years for this, to say Tunisians can get visa-free travel to Europe in the way they had it until Italy until 1990. But there is a roadmap, and it includes human rights conditions. In the way, the roadmap for Moldova included an anti-discrimination law, and I was in Moldova. I had a talk with the former president, a communist, who said, oh, we will never accept anti-homosexual discrimination laws. And in the end, Moldova did. And we've seen when there is a real incentive, a credible incentive that the public understands, not like money, credit, you know, yes, people like aid, but they don't really see it. You know, this is why conditionality is very indirect. But when you say Tunisia could become the first country in Africa that has visa-free travel again for tourists, plus, and this is a debate here in Berlin at the moment, the coalition treaty of the German government says one should offer more legal migration. Germany has a brilliant program for the Balkans. Anybody in the Balkans who gets a job in Germany, it's up to 20,000 a year, with no prior requirements of language skills or even qualification. It's enough to have a job, and a company that wants you can work in Germany. And there's a massive need in many different branches. And I talk to interest groups here, hundreds of thousands of jobs needed in handicraft, in electricians. I mean, very, very severe pressure on the labor market. Craft a program and now put this together. Make a package. Go to Tunisia and say, we want your economic, social, and political transition to be a success. Here is what we are prepared to offer. We want you to be the different vision to what we've seen in Libya and in Egypt and what we've seen in Algeria the last 20 years and what we see, of course, in the Middle East. We have a massive interest. There are hundreds of thousands of Tunisian citizens living already in the European Union. Here is our offer. And I think the moment you do that, you also can then have a reasonable debate on how you can stop 1,200 people drowning last year, 2021, in the central Mediterranean, not by relying on Libyan militias and bringing people back to Libyan prisons or detention centers, but by actually cooperating with Tunisia to say, listen, we want to open legal migration, we want to open legal mobility, we will also work on resettling refugees from West Africa, from North Africa, which is at the moment at zero. There is almost no resettlement, but we want to discourage irregular migration, not by pushbacks, not by letting people drown, not by cooperating with Libya, but as a joint effort of Europe and Tunisia, which increases mobility. And I think this is where we need to think. And why aren't we thinking in this direction? Because all the things I recommend have been done. These are all things, you know, we worked with interior ministers in Europe. We had 3 interior ministers advising us, Giuliano Amato in Italy, Otto Schily in Germany, Charles Clark in the United Kingdom, former interior ministers, how to persuade interior ministers to lift the visa requirement. All of South America, except Cuba and I think Bolivia, have visa-free travel to Europe, all of them. Not a single country in Africa, not even small Tunisian democracy. So I think let's think of ways we can persuade Europeans. And what Radwan said, have a vision for the next 5 and 10 years. How can we get a young population and a political elite to look to Europe, not with this old game, we give you money, you do this, but we can have contact. We can have a transformation. We can have something similar to here as we've seen in Central Europe in the last 20 years. And this will not solve problems, all problems. This will not solve all conflicts. I mean, we've, as Radwan said, we have conflicts in Poland, in Hungary, in the US, in France, but it will put, I think, Tunisia on a different path of development, where autocracy and return to one-man rule would simply not be feasible and not work. That's what we need. And then we don't have a trade-off between controlling irregular migration, which is deadly, and we should try to stop it, but we should not do it at the expense of human lives. There is then no trade-off. There is the offer of a partnership.
Well, I mean, of course, I love the way this sounds, but you know, today, after I was glad to hear that my native country is actually Romania, for those who don't know. So I was very glad to hear that Romania says that they are prepared for for refugees from Ukraine, and that they will open up. There's a lot of sympathy for Ukraine and support and the rest. But then, the next day, the parliament invited the director of the intelligence service, who went there and say, wait, we have to screen everybody. Who knows what the Russians are going to send? Okay, and I think that in the case of Arab countries, I think there's quite a lot of concern about security, about potential terrorist infiltration and the rest of this. So I see the advantage of your proposal, but I also think it's going to be quite very serious oppositions from the security establishment in Europe to this radical proposal. Radwan, what do you think?
It's not radical, sorry. And it can only work if it addresses the concerns of interior. I mean, I would not start promoting this in foreign ministries. I would start promoting this in interior ministries, because it's the internal affairs ministries who know that, for example, at the moment, the biggest number of people who come irregularly across the central Mediterranean are Tunisians. They cross in little boats, they arrive in Europe, there is no screening, and a majority of them stays in Europe. Now, since there is not much good cooperation, Tunisia takes back some of its citizens, but most of them stay, even if they have to leave. That is a loss of control. And the terrorist who killed people with a truck in Berlin was a Tunisian who'd been in Europe for many, many years. In an organized cooperation, he would have been deported years before he could commit a crime. Because if we enable mobility for students, for tourists, for people with families, for business people, if we enable legal mobility, which doesn't mean people are not screened, they still need a passport, and we have cooperation. I remember my last sentence on this. I remember a conversation I had in the Italian Interior Ministry with the Italian Interior Minister at the time, telling me that, visas are a very blunt instrument. If I have a trusted cooperation, a partner, a Ministry of Interior or Justice on the other side that I can work with, I'm much more secure. And that was, of course, the argument with which it was possible to get a qualified majority, which is a supermajority of internal affairs ministers in Europe, to lift the visa requirement for Albania, for Bosnia, for Montenegro, for Serbia, for Moldova, for Georgia, and for Ukraine. And Ukraine, a country with 40 million people, which is poorer per capita than Tunisia is, and has a war, lifting visa requirements until now has created no problems at all for Europe. So you're right. Security concerns will be raised. People will say, isn't this a threat? And then you need to show how a well-structured process creates more mobility and more security. And we have no interest in radical groups in Tunisia exploiting frustration about lack of development and lack of mobility. That is the worst for both sides of the Mediterranean.
Yes, I get the point. So bigger carrot, and we should offer something which speaks to the people more rather than general aid, because they might be concerned that aid does not drill down to each of them. Radwan, what do you say to this solution? Is it something that we should?
I honestly love this idea. I think it's great. I think that Tunisia is suffering now from about 15 to 18% unemployment, but it's almost 50% among young educated people with college degrees in engineering, in medicine, in pharmacies, with highly qualified young people who can either travel to Europe, can study in Europe, can work in Europe. And now actually they can work for European companies from Tunisia, with the Zoom and with the online now, people work remotely. They don't even need to be in Europe. They can get jobs and then move back to Tunisia. I think they would love to be able to do that, where they live in Tunisia but work for European companies or immigrate. I think this obviously is the way of the future, and it's a great incentive to reduce unemployment in Tunisia and to help Tunisia's economy recover. But again, it has to be attached to conditions about reopening the parliament, respecting the constitution, not just human rights, but democratic governance, respecting free and fair elections and independence of the judiciary and all of that. And if we do that, Tunisia can become a model democracy for the entire Arab world. Imagine what the EU will gain from that. If the entire Arab world becomes a democracy and becomes a stable democracy and a prosperous democracy, I really think it's possible. I really think in the case of Tunisia, it's possible now. It's possible this year. We can achieve this year. In the case of other countries, it will take a little bit longer, but once they see a successful model in Tunisia, when they see a country that is prospering, that is building a better life and better job and opportunities for the young people, where they can travel back and forth to Europe, but they don't necessarily need to stay in Europe. Tunisia, as you know, is a beautiful country, has a lot of advantages to living in Tunisia, is a lot less expensive if they live in Tunisia. And but they need jobs. They don't have jobs right now in Tunisia. They need investments. So I think it's a win-win. You know, it's a win for Europe. It's a win for Tunisia, and it will build real stability, and it will solve the problem of migration because people will be free to travel, but under the law. Of course, you have to scrutinize people and screen people to avoid, you know, criminals or terrorists or whatever. But of course, you know that those are very small in number. The majority are law-abiding citizens, and Europe will benefit tremendously from their talents. Tunisia also will benefit. So I think it's a great idea. I like it very much, Gerald, and I hope we can make it work.
Well, of course, I believed in this solution for the Balkans. I believed in this solution for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. So definitely, I would believe in it for North Africa. But I have to play my role here and question the realism of the proposals that we make. And now let me question a little bit this conditionality. I mean, you make it sound very simple, Radwan, but when researching for my last book, which is on Europe's good governance promotion for the past 15 years, I discovered quite a large number of situations where 10 years ago, Europe could have done what you suggest now. And we didn't do. I mean, we just failed to be so radical and clear and to attach a clear condition to our money. But we did try this more in the past 3-4 years, except that the context has changed. And when we really challenged bad dictators or, you know, coup leaders or people like this in various places, we out of the sudden, we have the situation that we see these days in Mali. We have the situation that somebody else exists, right, who didn't exist there 10 years ago, China or Russia or somebody who doesn't care for democracy and who comes and say, you know what, let the Europeans live with their money. You know, I will come, I will give you the money, I will even, you know, build you the railroad or the highway or whatever we need. I mean, isn't there a danger if Europe cuts everything to Tunisia and conditioning for the restoration of democracy that somebody else will in fact step in?
Not really. Let me tell you why. I think, yes, of course, China and Russia will always try to step in and will always try to say, hey, come to our side and we'll give you what you want. But in the case of Tunisia in particular, as I said earlier, I think Tunisians have tasted freedom. I think the Tunisians have tasted what it means to be a free human being. This is a very, very powerful feeling. This is a very powerful incentive. They want economic growth to go along with that freedom. Of course, they are not happy with freedom that doesn't deliver economic growth. But going to the Russian model or the Chinese model means that they have to forget their freedom. They have to forget democracy. And I promise you, I guarantee you, Tunisians are not willing to do that. Tunisians want to preserve freedom, to preserve democracy, and build on top of it, or build in addition to it, economic prosperity and economic growth. So they are very much attached to the European model, to the US model, because it's the democratic model. You know, it's a model that delivers freedom with prosperity, not prosperity at the expense of freedom.
Alina, can I add something? Because we might, I mean, for some in the audience, we might come across here as naive and optimistic and idealistic. But of course, my colleagues and myself at this moment, we are working on all the challenges to the rule of law in Poland, to the rule of law in Hungary, to the credibility of the European Union in the Balkans. And you are completely right. In the last few years, a lot of that credibility has diminished. But what I hope for, and this is literally events this week, the ideological challenge that the Russian president offered in his speech on Monday, he wasn't just challenging Ukraine statehood, Ukrainian identity. He was challenging the very idea that has created the most peaceful Europe for those who have been lucky enough to be part of it. Not the Balkans, not Georgia, not Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia, Ukraine, but for those who were able to join the most peaceful Europe in history. He challenged the very idea. It's an ideological fight. It's a fight of values. So what I hope for is that this is also a moment where people in Paris and Berlin and Brussels and other capitals realize, wait, if we don't want to be on the back foot all the time, you know, it's always Russia serving and we just have to respond. This is not a good way to win a tennis game. We need to go ahead. And the way to go ahead is to develop, wait, we've done things in the past which worked. We sort of were becoming lazy, complacent. We lost the understanding that what matters most is having a convincing story. You know, we need a story of a credible, better future that the young, that political leaders, that the cultural elites can believe in and can spread and can make a national story. But for this, we need a different kind of optimism. Realism, yes, but we need to be able to think. We managed to preserve peace in Bosnia after genocide and ethnic cleansing for 25 years. Then we dropped the ball. We're not offering Bosnians any credible perspective at the moment. Well, let's do that, and we will see that we will have another 25 years of peace. Let's offer something to Serbs, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and let's offer something to Tunisians. Let's be proactive with things we've done. I think this isn't being complacent, but it also isn't being idealistic. It's massively in the European interest to show that the values which have worked, the strategies which have worked, we need to extend them where we can. And there are clear limits. And, you know, we can't export democracy as we've seen to any country we want to, and certainly not by military force. But the power of attraction and contact, it has worked. War between Hungary and Romania, or Hungary and Slovenia, or the Baltic states and Poland, or is unthinkable. You know, it's crazy even to mention it. This wasn't the case 3 decades ago. When I lived in Ukraine and I taught economics at Ukraine, now it's ages ago, 1993, war between Ukraine and Russia seemed crazy, unthinkable. Well, it has happened because there's been no framework. There's been no convergence of values. And we are back. The rhetoric of Mr. Putin today is exactly the rhetoric we heard from nationalist leaders in the Balkans in the 1990s, leading to war after war after war.
Yeah, well, I of course love to be more optimistic, but I ask myself, you know, in the same time, if separating Europe on one side and Russia on the other is which is not really the factor which increased so much tension on Ukraine, which was in between. And also, I'm afraid that it's very difficult even within the European Union. So, you know, we really need deep commitment to Europeanization, because we speak a lot about Hungary, we speak a lot about Poland, but there are other countries in Europe where things are not where it should be. You know, I mean, sometimes as a person who knows rule of law well, I really feel bad for Poland, you know, because Greece had been horrible tampering with the courts for years, when nobody in Europe ever cared for it. There is no report on Europe, there's been no sanction and nothing like this. I mean, definitely we have to press Poland because it's an important, you know, game for our credibility there. But on the other hand, it's difficult sometimes, even within the European Union. So the question really is, how can we adjust our tools, as you say, to be attractive, not just to punish people, because punishment is really not attractive. And in particular, if you enlarge and make such a big packet of things that you sell, that a part of the voters is really not with us. I mean, we have to understand the world is a complex place. In Eastern Europe, we have traditional voters as well. In Tunisia, I'm sure traditional voters as well. I mean, we shouldn't treat people like they all endorse the same values. It should be enough for us if they all endorse the values of democratic change, that who loses elections goes peacefully at home and does not put his opponents in jail. It really seems to me very complicated and ambitious to, force a broader spectrum of values on people. So what do we do that? I will simply end by asking each of you if there would be one thing that you can fix in Europe's democracy promotion. What would that be on top of what we discussed already? That you would like to see happening? Radwan, should you start?
I can start. I think that be more positive and be more optimistic about the future. Have a vision, for the future. It's okay, everybody, especially last 2 or 3 years, we've all been afraid because of the pandemic. It's had its toll on all of us. But if you don't have a dream, if you don't have a vision for a better future, you can never achieve it. You can never get there. So have a better dream, have a better vision for a future. Don't be stuck in the present or in the past. We can build a better future if we talk about it, if we think about it, and if we design it and implement it. Don't be afraid of religion, or in the case of Tunisia or the Arab world, of religious conservatives. Religion is still important in Tunisia, is still important in the Arab world, but religion can be modernized. Religion can play a positive role even in a democracy. Don't be afraid that there are religious actors in Tunisia, like An-Nahda, for example, or there are other Islamic parties in Iraq or whatever. Through democracy, they will modernize their thinking. They will become more open to democracy and democratic values. It will be better for them. It will be better for the region. It will be better for Europe. So don't let fear control your impulses and your policies. Fear is sometimes needed, but have a bigger vision, have a better dream for the region. That's my appeal to my European friends.
Gerald, last word to you.
Well, I would agree with this. I would also say realism requires focus. So where there are opportunities, I would not know what to advise now on Algeria or Egypt, but from looking at Tunisia or looking at Moldova, looking at Ukraine, which managed, despite 8 years of war, to hold democratic elections. We all know about the problems of democracy and corruption in Ukraine, but a newcomer was able to win an election, like in France. This is really impressive. We don't have the same leader for decades. We don't have political prisoners. We don't have opposition people suddenly dying, except when there is involvement by the big neighbor. This is very, very encouraging. I think we need to focus. Europe needs to focus where we can make a difference. It's not through blunt conditionality or bribery. It's very important to give an example to show that Europe can deal with these challenges inside the European Union. I mean, at this moment, we are working on Poland, where you're right. There have been problems in other countries, but what we see in Poland now is in many ways is unique. The amount of power in the hands of one minister of justice to control everything that happens in a courtroom, the prosecutors, the court presidents, to discipline judges. But I am confident that if the European Union uses its checks and balances and instruments and incentives, this can be overcome. And that is what is missing around Europe. If we look at the area around this area of prosperous democratic integration, it is devastating. We've had a war in the Caucasus, we've had wars in Ukraine, we've had, of course, wars in the Middle East, we've had coups and repression and torture in Egypt and Belarus, a civil war in Libya. But we haven't had wars where people have joined the European Union, and that is worth a lot. That's a capital we can build on. And the challenge is not to lose the confidence. And I don't believe there is a trade-off here between controlling borders and irregular migration and trying to promote democracy. For some there is. They think just throw money at autocrats and they stop migrants. That's not how it works. That's not what we did with Turkey. We gave Turkey money for the Syrians in Turkey, which was a very good investment, so their children can go to school. I think with a smart policy, you can have both, because in the end, you need partners, and it's in Europe's interest to have more democracies emerge and strengthen. And that's been true for 20 years, and there are these intellectual fashions, and now the fashion is to say it doesn't work. I don't think that's the evidence is backing up the pessimists.
Well, absolutely. And just to end my only optimistic words, since I had to challenge you at the end of this conversation, it came to my mind another advantage of our freedom of travel policy for neighbors that we promoted for so many years. I've been doing voting models for the Moldovan voters for 20 years. And what really changed the game there, what made the Democrats, pro-Europeans, win the last two elections is simply the fact that they got the freedom to travel. And the critical mass now is of people who travel and work in the European Union and their families. And this is why Russia is not going to win elections in Moldova ever again, although demography was favoring them 20 years ago. So yes, you can definitely use this kind of practical advantages. Democracy promotion doesn't mean only lectures or only conditions. It also means these very positive incentives that you can give to people to win them over and then to turn them into your agent, an agent of democracy when in their own countries where they commute or actually eventually come back. I love the idea of Tunisians working from sunny Tunisia actually for a German company. I think it's a great idea, in particular, since the German company really needs them, these days. Thank you both. Exactly. We hope that we don't leave people depressed. There are quite very serious challenges these days, but yes, with a positive narrative, focusing very well on what we can do and what people really want, what we can deliver. We will survive and hopefully win more countries and offer even an ever more enlarged continent with our neighbors and friends. Thank you very much to everybody, and see you in 3 weeks' time for the next Democracy Promotion Series. Good evening.
Thank you, Alina.
Have a nice day.
Thank you, Gerald. Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye to everyone.
Take care.